You hear the front door open, and then you hear the familiar sound of the keys hitting the bowl next to the door. Then come the footsteps, heavy footsteps moving from the entryway to the kitchen. So you call out, "Hey, I'm in here," but there's no answer. So you call again, still nothing. And then you receive a text from your husband that says, "Leaving work now, be home in 20 minutes. And that was when you realized the person that just walked into your house shouldn't be there. Hey friends, welcome back to the Spooky Files. If you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. And if you're new here, we're so glad to have you. I'm your host, Mary Ellen Quigley. This is where we dive into the paranormal, the unexplained, the I swear I saw something, but I don't want to admit it moments that we all have and now have a place to talk about them. Today's episode is one of my favorite topics because it can happen to anyone and it's so creepy. We're talking about the folklore of doppelgängers. These stories are a phenomenon that has happened for generations. All across the world, encounters that seemed completely ordinary until they weren't. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. So what is a doppelganger? Let's start there. The word doppelganger comes from German and is often translated as double goer. In folklore, it usually means a double, wraith, or apparition of a living person. And that detail matters. In fact, the Encyclopaedia Britannica describes it as an apparition of a living person separate from the idea of a traditional ghost. Now, with a ghost story, at least it has a framework, right? So someone died, something lingered, and a place became haunted. But with a doppelganger, the person is still there. Maybe they're at work, maybe they're asleep. They may even be miles away. And they may even walk into the room 5 minutes after their double was already seen there. And folklore has not always treated this as harmless. In some traditions, seeing your own double was considered a terrible omen. It could mean illness, it could mean danger, and it could even mean death. The Encyclopaedia Britannica also notes that meeting one's own double has long been interpreted as a sign that death may be near. And that gives these stories a darker edge because if you see a stranger who looks like someone you know, maybe that's a coincidence. But if you see your mother walk into a room when she's actually at work, or you hear your husband come home before he has even left his workplace, or if someone swears they saw you standing in a hallway that you've never been in, that feels different. It's like reality has folded over on itself for a second, or like something borrowed a familiar face. Doppelgangers are not the only version of this idea, though. Different cultures have different names for doppelgangers. So, for example, in Irish folklore, there is the idea of the fetch, which is a supernatural double or apparition of a living person, and the sighting of a fetch is often described as an omen, which is usually connected to impending death. And then there's the Scandinavian concept of the Vardøger. This one is especially creepy because it matches so many modern stories. The Vardøger is described as a spiritual predecessor. So it's a person's presence that arrives before they actually do so in person. So you might hear someone's voice before they come home, or you might hear their footsteps on the stairs, but they're not there yet. You'll smell their perfume or hear the door open. And then a few minutes later, the person arrives and does the same exact thing. And that's different from a traditional doppelganger, but it belongs in the same family of stories. And I think the reason these stories creep me out so much is because they're usually very small and domestic and quiet. It's simple things like hearing someone come home from work rather than your traditional spooky ghost story where it's like some big, elaborate, frightening moment. These aren't that way at all. So let's jump into some listener-submitted stories so you can hear a little bit more about their experiences. And our first story comes from Anna. Anna says that this happened about 3 years ago when her husband was working second shift. He usually got home around 11:30 at night, so Anna had a routine that she would follow. She would lock the door, turn on the porch light, leave his dinner in the microwave, and then she would usually sit in the living room and wait for him to text that he was on his way. One night around 10:45, she heard his truck pull into the driveway. And she knew the sound of that truck because he had a pretty loud engine. She remembers being annoyed because he hadn't texted her to tell her that he was on the way home. And she thought, well, great, he forgot to tell me he was leaving early. She heard the front door open. She heard his keys hit the little ceramic bowl by the entryway. Then she heard him cough, the exact sound he always made when the cold air hit him. So Anna called from the living room, food's in the microwave, but there was no answer. She waited and she called again. Still nothing. So she got up and walked into the kitchen, but there was nobody there. The front door was still locked and the keys were not in the bowl. So she looked out the window and to her surprise, his truck was also not in the driveway. So she told herself that maybe she was imagining things because she was really sleepy and had been half asleep on the couch. So she thought maybe she heard the neighbor's truck. Maybe it was a sound coming from the TV. And then her phone buzzed. It was a text coming from her husband saying, leaving now, be home in about 35. Anna stood in the kitchen staring at the message, trying to make it make sense. And when her husband actually got home, she didn't tell him right away. She just listened. His truck pulled in, the engine cut, the front door opened, his keys hit the ceramic bowl. He coughed. Then he walked into the kitchen and said, hey, honey, food still in the microwave? The exact same sequence had happened twice. The only difference was that the first time, he was not really there. So this experience fits in very closely with the Scandinavian Vardøger stories that we talked about earlier, where it's basically the person's presence coming ahead of their physical selves, which I think is really interesting. And she said that nothing else creepy ever happened after this. That was the one and only time that she experienced it. But again, it's such a weird, quiet moment, and really no one understands why this happened, but I would definitely be creeped out by it. Let's get into a real-life story of doppelgangers, and this is the case of Émilie Sagée. Now, this story was first published by Robert Dale Owens in his 1860s book, Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World. Owen said he received the account from Julie de Godenstube, a former student who claimed to have witnessed the strange events connected to Sagée. So Émilie Sagée was a French teacher in the 1840s, and according to the story, she was working at a girls' school when the students and staff began seeing something impossible. They saw her double, not once or even twice, but repeatedly. And in one version of the story, Sagée was standing at the front of the classroom writing on the board. The students could see her clearly, but then beside her, another figure appeared, and it looked exactly like her. It moved like her, it mirrored her gestures, but Sagée herself seemed unaware of it. And the students were terrified. And that was not the only incident. Another time, the students were reportedly gathered in the room doing needlework. In the windows, they could see the real Émilie Sagée outside in the garden. But then her double appeared inside the room, sitting in her chair. The same chair where she would normally supervise them. Some students were brave enough to approach it. And according to the story, the figure felt strange, not fully solid, but also not fully air. What makes the Sagée story so effective is that it's not just the idea of a double, it's the idea of a public double. Multiple people allegedly saw it. The double appeared while Sagée herself was alive, sometimes while she was nearby, and sometimes while she was visible at the same time. And if we're being honest, there are reasons to be cautious with this story because it does come through old spiritualist literature, and those accounts can be difficult to verify. We don't have modern documentation, and we don't have video. We also don't have a clean paper trail in the way that we would want it today. But as folklore, It's one of our strongest because it captures the exact fear at the heart of these encounters. What if your body is not the only version of you moving through the world? All right, another listener story. This story is from Jenna, and it's called Mom Was in the Hallway. Jenna said that she was around 8 or 9 when this happened. Her mom worked at a hospital and often did not get home until after midnight. Jenna knew this, everyone in the house knew this, but one night while she was laying in bed, she saw her mother walk down the hallway. Her bedroom door was cracked open because she was afraid of the dark. And through the narrow opening, she saw her mom pass by. She was wearing her blue scrubs, her hair was pulled back. She even smelled her mother's perfume. So she called out, "Mom." The figure stopped. And this is the part that still bothers her. Her mother didn't turn around, which was very unlike her. She just stood there in the hallway with her back to the bedroom door. So Jenna called for her again. "Mom." The figure moved again, but this time it walked into the bathroom and shut the door. Jenna waited for the light to turn on, but it didn't. And she waited to maybe hear the toilet flush or hear the sink, and she didn't. So finally, she got out of bed and walked to the bathroom door because she just wanted to hug her mom goodnight. But when she knocked, there was no answer. So she opened it, and the bathroom was empty. Her dad was asleep on the couch. The front door was locked, and her mother was still at work. Years later, Jenna brought it up to her mom, expecting her to laugh it off. But her mom got quiet. She told Jenna that around that same time, she had gotten extremely dizzy at work. She had almost passed out in a patient's room. And she remembered one thing very clearly, that she kept thinking, "I just want to go home." Jenna doesn't know what she saw, but she knows that it looked exactly like her mother. And she knows that whatever it was stopped when she called its name. So this one made me question a lot of things because I almost wonder if when her mother was dizzy and feeling like she was going to pass out, that maybe she did pass out for a little bit and that somehow her spirit went home. What do you guys think? Do you think somehow her mother had an out-of-body experience and went home for a little bit? Or do you think maybe this is just a coincidence? Let's talk about a different kind of doppelganger. This is where doppelganger stories start to overlap with another paranormal category, and this is called crisis apparitions. Now, a crisis apparition is usually described as the appearance of a person during a moment of serious danger, illness, death, or emotional distress, and they often appear to someone close to them. These stories are not always sinister, but they feel like warnings or goodbyes. Now, sometimes I feel like one person's spirit, energy, or presence has reached out at the exact moment something was wrong. That is different from the darker version of a doppelganger. And I think that's why these stories are hard to categorize. Because the experience itself might be almost identical, like you see your mother in the hallway or you hear your husband come home and he didn't, but the meaning completely changes depending on what happens next. So if the person was in danger, we call it a warning. If the person dies, we call it an omen. If nothing happens, then it's just creepy. And if the double seems aware of us, then we start to wonder whether it was ever really connected to the person at all. And that's when it becomes a mimic story. Okay, let's get into our very last listener submitted story. This one comes from Megan. Megan said that her sister had a baby monitor that recorded motion clips. One afternoon, her sister went to the grocery store with the baby. The house was empty, or it should have been. And while she was shopping, her phone sent her a motion alert from the nursery. Now, at first, she assumed it was their cat. So she opened the clip, and to her surprise, she saw herself wearing a messy bun and an oversized gray sweatshirt and a pair of black leggings. The figure walked slowly across the nursery, leaned over the crib like it was checking on the baby, but the baby was not home. The crib was empty. Megan's sister said she froze right there in the grocery aisle. She watched the clip again, then again, and every time she was more sure. It looked like her, it moved like her, and and it was wearing the same exact outfit she was wearing. But she was standing in the grocery store holding a bag of apples while her baby sat in the cart in front of her. She called her husband. He was at work. She called her neighbor. The neighbor went over and checked the house from outside. There were no broken windows, no open doors, and nothing strange. When Megan's sister finally got home, she walked straight to the nursery. The crib was empty. The window was locked. The closet was empty. But then she noticed something sitting in the rocking chair. Her gray sweatshirt. The one from the video. But there was one problem with this gray sweatshirt. She was still wearing hers. She didn't scream or run, but she stood there looking at the sweatshirt on the chair and the sweatshirt on her body. She even picked up the one from the chair and it smelled like her detergent. And she swears that it wasn't there when she left. She was so freaked out that she threw both sweatshirts in the garbage. And she has never been able to explain how she saw two of the exact same sweatshirt or who was wearing the second one in the nursery that day. Now, when I first read this story, I thought, well, maybe it's a glitch in the recording system. Like maybe this was footage from earlier in the day, that it somehow was glitching and showing her that it was happening in real time, but it was actually an old recording. But when she said that she went home and found the sweatshirt in the chair, that freaked me out because it really makes you wonder, how did someone break in? I'm not quite sure what it was, and I'm not sure if you guys have any ideas either. So what are we supposed to do with doppelganger stories? Well, there's obvious explanations for some of them, right? Some of them could be stress, sleep deprivation, mistaken identity, grief, memory filling in details after the fact, or a person's brain trying to make the sense of a sound and assigning it to a person that it expects to hear. And honestly, some of the stories may be just that. Human perception isn't perfect, and memory also isn't perfect. And when we're tired, scared, or emotionally overwhelmed, our brains can do some really strange things. But that does not explain every story neatly. It doesn't explain the stories where multiple people see the same double, or where the double appears before the real person arrives and repeats the same actions. It doesn't explain stories where someone is seen in a place they physically could not be. And it definitely does not explain the feeling witnesses describe again and again of recognition followed by dread, followed by fear. That's when the ordinary moment turns against you, because seeing a shadow in the corner is scary. Hearing a strange voice is scary. But seeing someone you love and realizing maybe that's not them is different. It's a whole new level of scary. So this week, I want to know, have you ever seen someone in a place they couldn't have possibly been? Have you ever had someone tell you they saw you someplace you never were? Or have you ever had any kind of doppelganger experience in the past? If you did, I would love to hear about it. And that brings us to the end of this episode of The Spooky Files. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, follow me on social media, leave a comment because I love hearing from all of you. If you have a story you would like me to share on the podcast, you can send an email to thespookyfilespodcast@gmail.com or fill out the contact us form on thespookyfilespodcast.com. I read every single email or message, and it helps us build a community of people that don't just love a creepy story, but also are looking for a place where they can talk about all the things they don't always admit out loud. If you're looking for more paranormal content, check out my other podcast, Hoosier Myths and Legends, where my sister and I share all things spooky from the state of Indiana. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep it spooky, my friends.